Okay, we're gonna look at factoring trinomials. To be more specific, factoring quadratic trinomials. So what does factoring quadratic trinomials looks like? Okay, first of all, let's write the general form of a quadratic trinomial in standard form. Okay, so in this case, what we have here is the quadratic equation, and it is a trinomial. Okay, and the general form would be ax squared plus bx plus c. Now is equals to 0. Now this is very important. Okay, one of the most important reason why we factor quadratic trinomial is so that we can find the zeros. Okay, and what does the zeros mean? Well, the zeros are basically the solution set of the quadratic trinomial. It is finding the value of x, or the values of x, that makes this quadratic trinomial true when we plug those values in. So we do have three different names. Sometimes we call it x-intercepts, okay, and then sometimes we call them roots, and sometimes we call them zeros. Now when we look at the graph of a quadratic function, it's a parabola, something like this, and the x-intercepts or roots or zeros are points on the parabola where it crosses the x-axis. If this is x and then this is y. Okay, so how does this help us? How does factoring quadratic trinomial help us to find these values? Well, if I write an equation something like x squared plus 5x plus 6, it's not that intuitive to find the value of x that we can just plug in. We can try 1. For instance, 1 squared is 1, 5 times 1 is 5, 1 plus 5 is 6, 6 plus 6 would be 12. So we can do it by trial and error, and some of these might take a very long time. So we're gonna come up with a short technique, which is the factoring method. Now we call it the product of zero property, or the zero product property. What is the zero product property? Let's say we do have two things that are multiplied and then they equals to 0. Now in order to make this equation true, either of the two must be 0, meaning that either a must be 0 or b must be 0, or both of them can be 0. So any of these three scenarios give us a true statement. So when we multiply two things, we end up with 0, then either of the two things must be 0 or both of them must be 0. Using this zero product property, we can factor x squared plus 5x plus 6 and then figure out what makes each of the factors 0. So let's go ahead and then rewrite these, which is x squared plus 5x plus 6 is equals to 0. Now in order to factor this, we're gonna use a couple of different techniques: the box method, the tic-tac-toe method, sum and product method. We have a couple of them. So let's say that this thing actually equals to x plus 3 and then x plus 2. Now we do have two things that are multiplied together to give me the bigger thing, and then we can quickly check this if this is true. Let's go ahead and then put the two values up there. We got x here, we got 3, and then here we got x and 2. Now when we multiply these two, we get x times x is x squared, x times 3 would be 3x, 2 times x would be 2x, 2 times 3 would be 6, and then we do have two like terms in this case, which is 2x and 3x. So when we combine them, we get x squared, which is the first one. 2x plus 3x will be 5x, and then plus 6. So we know that the product of these two things actually equals to our original quadratic trinomial. So we're going to learn how we get from here to here using those techniques that we just mentioned, box method or summing product. But once we get that, how do we find the roots? Well, the product of two numbers is equals to 0, then either of these two must be 0 or both of them must be 0. So when we look at x plus 3 and then x plus 2 is equal to 0, either x plus 3 is equal to 0 or x plus 2 is equal to 0. And then in this case we take away 3 from both sides, and then we get negative 3, and then we get x is equals to negative 3. That's the first one, and then this is the first root. And then the same thing happens here. We take away 2 from both sides, x equals negative 2. And this is how we find the roots or the zeros or the y-intercepts. So the other way we can do it, once we get to the factors, we can just look at it and then see what makes each of them 0. In this case, in order to make x plus 3 0, we gotta put negative 3 there, because negative 3 plus 3 is 0, and then 0 times negative 3 plus 2, which is negative 1, is 0. So once we get one of the factors to be 0, then we don't have to worry about the other one, because 0 times anything will be 0. The same thing here, x plus 2 is equal to 0, then x must be negative 2 to make it 0. So this is how we find the roots or the x-intercept, or we also call them the zeros. Okay, so in summary, we have the quadratic trinomial, which is x squared plus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0. This is the actual equation. From the equation we got the factors x plus 2 and then x plus 3 is equal to 0, and then from that we got x is equals to negative 2 and x equals negative 3 to be the roots. So I'm gonna go ahead and then write this one. These are x-intercept, or let's go ahead and then call them roots right here, and then these are called factors. And then the last one, the first one, will be the actual equation. Now we can only do this if the right side is equal to 0. That's one of the reasons that we call this thing the zeros, because when we plug these values back into the equation we get zeros. And this is how, or this is why we actually factor quadratic trinomials. Now the trick is, how do we get from the equation to the factor? And then we're gonna see some of the techniques in the next video, and this completes this one.